we met in the first time we met was in Canada on a conference about research-based theater. And
yes.
I think we better start from that. And so what do you think about this label, research-based theater? And what is its relationship to, the kind of theater we are more familiar with, I would say mainstream or conventional theater? Yeah.
It's, I suppose for me, it's partly, it's a very broad title, isn't it? I mean, research-based theatre, and I think there are also quite a few cultural differences in terms of how we would perceive that. And I've noticed that also you've got another question about documentary theatre, or what we might call reminiscence theatre. I sort of understand through particularly through my contact actually with George Bellevue and previously through Marv Westwood at the University of British Columbia, that when I look at the way that they work in research-based theatre, it's academically very stringent. Evaluation plays a very, very important part in it. It has academic rigor, and within that framework, that they are working with perhaps quite vulnerable groups. In the case of the work that I went to look at originally, they were working with Canadian military veterans. And so I was very intrigued by the framework around that kind of work, how that before they even got near getting onto the stage, it looked months and months and months of research and preparation and planning and dialogue and debate had gone into to approaching the stage, and I find that really, really interesting. It also raises lots of issues. I think the role of an academic partner in theatre, and you're talking about mainstream theatre as well, is interesting. And for me, it's fairly new, really. I mean, I originally trained as a professional actor in London in the 80s, worked as an actor, and then became very interested in what we would then call in the late 90s participatory theatre. And obviously applied theatre has kind of grown alongside those things. But I found the role of a university, of an academic drama department, perhaps also working alongside other departments, like, for example, Grant, who produced the beautiful piece of work with First Nation American students working on that story, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, was working with social work students. So I think that with research-based theatre, I'm quite excited by the different layers of collaboration, that you have different departments, sociology, you may have social sciences, you may have film, you may have social work, but ultimately you have a belief that theatre is going to have a role. And I think that's really, really interesting, because I'm intrigued by where that decision is made, that theatre will be the right place to explore living memory, to explore, sometimes difficult or painful stories. And when I was reading the book that's recently been produced by University of British Columbia and George Bellevue about the working with military veterans on research-based theatre, and the layers, like an onion, the layers of preparation they had done, working through the Veterans Transition Program with psychologists like Marv Westwood, working with veterans, working through hours of therapy, and then looking at whether the stage was going to be an appropriate venue or place, a safe space for them to perform their own stories. And so I suppose the thing that really struck me and strikes me about research-based theatre at its best is the huge amount of ethical thinking, the collaboration, the time that is spent and often time, as we know in professional theatre, is something you have very little of. I mean, historically, going back years in Britain with rep theatre, you'd have a 2-week rehearsal period and maybe a 3 months, 6 months run of a play. So to see it from the other end with research-based theatre, you know, months of build-up towards maybe only a handful of performances, and then an academic evaluation and an audience evaluation and a participant evaluation of the value of what took place, I find really, really interesting. And in many ways it's quite foreign to my world, which originally was through professional theatre, then participatory theatre, and then working very much in care settings, institutionalized care settings, where we looked at the therapeutic use of theatre, working with vulnerable older people and with intergenerational groups.
Mm. And yes, you mentioned documentary theatre. There's I tend to use documentary theatre more in the past, because when I was first introduced to this kind of theatre because a friend of mine has seen Laramie Project in in the beginning of the millennium in New York, and then he told me about that, and well, I was spellbound about this way of doing, because as I was training, I was trained in the Hong Kong Academy for Performing Arts. Then that's kind of a traditional conservatory type of drama school. So I haven't heard about this term at all, and documentary theatre. So it's a very new thing to me, and I was fascinated by the way the way of making theatre in documentary theatre. So, and I know in the 90s, since the 90s, documentary theatre in the UK has in fact been gone through a kind of renaissance, I would say, or in another label, verbatim theatre is it's very popular since the 90s and also in the beginning of millennium, I think.
I think partly. So I joined. I'm just thinking of the timelines you've given there, which are really interesting. So I joined Age Exchange in 1998, and Age Exchange is regarded as the first, as it was then in 1983 when it was founded, the first reminiscence theatre company, promoting both professional reminiscence theatre, intergenerational reminiscence theatre, and reminiscence theatre with older people who were performing their own stories. And certainly a couple of years before I joined Age Exchange, I was beginning I worked with a company called Shape UK, and they created theatre with disabled young actors, and also young actors with autism, Asperger's, with other mental health conditions as well, and we did some really, I think, really interesting work then. And I think has to be said, with the new Labour government that came into power in 1997, I think there was a real opening up of the arts from what had been quite a conventional place to actually the mainstream opened up, and suddenly things like documentary and the valuing of people's stories and participatory theatre and older people's theatre and lots of what had been on the fringe came into the mainstream and were funded, and it was much more easy to access funding for what I would call innovative work. And that carried on through from the mid-90s through to I was probably, the mid to late probably 2005, 2010, that kind of period. Verbatim theatre has definitely a history in England, and my predecessor Pam Schweitzer, who founded Age Exchange, who'd originally been a teacher, she actually originally looked at setting up Age Exchange to collect the stories of older people, and then to find ways for older people to work with younger people and for them to perform the elders' stories together. And it was very much that valuing of oral histories, of untold stories, and very much of stories of people who are often forgotten and on the fringes. And sometimes those are stories of the individuals, but quite often Pam and then latterly me, we were looking at thematic stories, untold thematic stories. So we did a lot of work on the London docks, working with dockers and lightermen and stevedores. I did a lot of work with the Maritime Merchant Navy. Pam worked with women who had worked in munitions factories. I worked with men and women who had worked in cotton factories in the north of England, and looking at how you could bring those stories of what some people would describe as ordinary working people. We wouldn't see it as that. I often think they are extraordinary and unique, but those untold stories to the stage. And I think at its best, documentary theatre, verbatim theatre, is absolutely electric. It has a power to it which really takes your breath away, and a lot of that depends on how you work with the author, how you work with the elder to help them tell this, because that's the thing I'm most interested in. I'm not really that interested so much in my professional team. I'm more interested in how you can enable the older person themselves to perform their story within the community or within a theatrical context, and that way in which you look at trying to give them an understanding of what role theatre has and how theatre can empower them. And of course, for many people, I would say for 99% of the older people I've worked with, they have not been familiar with theatre. They have not been familiar with art. So theatre in itself is new to them. And it's quite an interesting negotiation that takes place in order to say, well, where we begin by sitting and sharing our story, at what stage do we physically get up or push the wheelchair across the stage or whatever and say, we're now going to go from remembering to taking the past into the present and giving it life in a theatrical context. And also, of course, teaching older people who are often naturals, but skills in improvisation, in role play, in the use of song, in the use of colloquial language and so on, embodied memory, the body, all of those things which are new to them. What they have is their rich story, but if you're gonna bring them into a theatrical world which is new to them, you've actually got to make sure that is a safe place for them to go to, and that they believe that theatre can help them tell their story.
Yes, well, it's very interesting to me when you say that theater is new to them, because I thought well, theater in your culture is a popular thing, is something. Well, but I'll come back to that question.
Yeah. I think it's partly class related, to be honest with you. I mean, so many of the places that I've worked. So when I first joined Aid Exchange, we may be working in 20, 30 care homes a year. Residential care and daycare settings, and the vast majority of people, so now we're going back 20 years, they may have been to a pantomime. Most commonly, people who were in their sort of 80s and 90s in the year 2000, their experience of theatre was variety theatre or musical theatre, not musical, but musical theatre, which was in pubs and clubs, where people would do stand-up routines, comedians, people, singers, the sorts of shows where the audience got to throw stuff at the performers if they weren't very good. So it was a very raw way of performing, and it was a working class, very much a working class thing, musical. So, and in that way, it was interesting because when the older people come to performing their own stories, often the only thing they have to hold on to is that they've been to musical, that they've been and they have seen that way of standing up in front of an audience with no fourth wall and giving it out. And that's also very interesting because because they have had knowledge of that culture, that cultural experience, they tend to speak directly to the audience. There's no fourth wall. They expect someone to shout back at them or sing along with them. So it's quite interactive in that way, which is interesting.
It reminds me of Peter Chisholm.
Yes.
Peter Chisholm's works. Of course, I'm too young to see any of this, but when I read about the history of verbatim theatre in UK, and Peter Chisholm is a major player in this.
Yes, and when I was doing my master's degree, actually, he was somebody who was very much kind of spoken about, and his work was very much spoken about then, and he's one of the sort of fathers, isn't he, of verbatim theatre?
Yes. And music and songs and music are one of the major elements in his work. Yeah. Yes,
I think it's in a sense it's well, we'll come on to it. It's whatever works. It's whatever works in the context of making the story real and enabling the teller of the story, particularly if it's their own memory they're sharing, to help with the authenticity of that story. And often in I can only speak for British culture, and in particular I'll speak for London culture as it was, because that's where I am. Music has often played a very important role, particularly in the working classes. It's often had a particular role. Songs are sung for a particular reason, and often in care homes, when we're just running closed reminiscence projects with maybe 12 elders in a group, someone will share a memory and someone will begin to sing a song that reflects the feeling of behind that memory. That is a song from the 1920s, or is a song from the First World War, or and then they will all sing along. And that's a sort of a very, because I think those kinds of songs have a very cathartic role to play, and were traditionally sung in pubs. And grew up with that very particular post First World War culture.
And can you use that label? Your company, Reminiscence Art, Reminiscence Theatre. So can you say a bit about this term? Why do you use this label instead of verbatim theatre or oral history theatre? Yeah.
I think it's the thing is, we all get caught up, don't we, with these, and all the things that you've just said, that they are all names for the same thing, really. Yes. I think we tend to, it's a bit like, when you have a coat and you go home, you often tend to hang your coat on the same hook, but there are 3 other hooks you could have hung your coat on, and I think we reminiscence theatre, I suppose, it's an awful analogy, but there's often been a kind of cultural difference between how reminiscence was perceived and oral history was perceived, just to take the 2 of the terms. So oral history and the Oral History Society, which go about the business of recording untold stories of communities, industrial communities, fishing communities, people who came here from the Caribbean or whatever, it has to be done in a very particular way. There's a sort of rules around how histories are recorded and what those histories are used for, the history, I suppose, is what I'm saying, is what it's about. And whereas with reminiscence, I would say, for me, reminiscence relates more to the world of care and to the world of social care. Although the stories and the histories have immense value, particularly to the people who share them, but to the community in which those stories are shared, where our primary interest is in well-being. So there's a slight difference. Where I always perceive oral history as kind of being more about heritage and about the history for itself, Whereas reminiscence, although it has a very strong kind of connection to oral history, it actually also sits within the context of health and social care and the well-being of the person and the community who are sharing those stories. So I think when reminiscence theatre began, you know, and obviously I say it began, reminiscence theatre has really existed since the Greeks, and probably before in some way, you know, because it's very linked to storytelling, and we all do that, and all communities and cultures do that, just in different ways. But we at Age Exchange have traditionally worked with older people. We've worked quite often with older people who are coming towards the end of their lives. We've worked with older people who have not had access to the arts in their life. And quite often we work with older people who arrive at Age Exchange, maybe to volunteer or to join a project, who are themselves bereaved. They've lost their husband or wife. And so you know, when you're looking at their stories, you are aware of the context, and the context is, you know, I can't just take your story and say, thanks, that's great. I have a responsibility to you, because of all the things that I know about you, and because so often in reminiscence work, particularly in residential care or in hospitals or in institutions, the story that the person has, the reminiscence, is the only thing they have left. That they only have that, you know, that they have been moved into a home. They have been moved onto the fringes of society. In many places, of course, in this country, the care homes are built on the fringes of towns or outside cities or in the middle of nowhere, where older people who have lived full lives with responsibility, brought up children, lived through wars, you know, and so on, brought up, you know, 6 kids or something, are then put. So often when we work with older people, we are using reminiscence theatre and reminiscence arts in ways to try and empower them and to help them express their personal identity through the arts, but it's their story through the arts. And it could be, for me, it was mainly through theatre, but it might be through dance, it might be through music, it might be through visual arts. But we cannot forget that we have an ethical responsibility to that person. And additionally, we have an ethical responsibility to that person because we are expecting them to share their personal story. And that's a, you know, it's a really crucial thing.
Can you describe a bit about your usual procedure when you approach you know, a daycare home or some target group? Yeah.
I mean, I think it's also important, just going back to you know, your first question about research-based theatre. We have to remember theatre is not always right. You know, it's not always the right art form. Just to say that, I mean, I'm from a theatre background, and a bit of me wants to say it will always be the right art form. But but within the context of reminiscence theatre and the vulnerability often of your group, you need to have a think about whether the stage is always the right place for them. So that's the first thing you need to think about. Is theatre where we need to go with this particular project? There are the kind of 3 strands really to reminiscence theatre. And that is a lot of the work that I've created, particularly in the early days, was working with vulnerable elders in care homes, using theatre. And using theatre as a means for them to work together as a group, to create a group dynamic in a home where often there was no group dynamic, and then to find the stories that they wanted to share and to perform those stories back out to the community. And that was always a big place, to take them out of the care home to a theatre, to take them to a place where they could interact with that community once more. The other side of our theatre is often being to bring the generations together and to create intergenerational theatre, or to create thematic theatre based specifically on the history of a community. It might be an industrial community or a fishing community or whatever. But so generally the way that we would work, if we take the experience, say, of working in care homes, we would go into a home and we would run a pretty traditional reminiscence project. So let's say that we are working with maybe 10 to 12 elders. They would always be invited. We would never say, well, coming into the home, bring people in to work with us. We would always send an invitation, and each invitation would go to each person's room as though we were putting it through their letterbox. Would you like to come and share your story? Age Exchange is going to come along for 12 weeks or 3 months, and we'll be meeting at this time in this space. And it's always crucial, if you're working in a care home, to insist that the managers find you a space which is not in the space where everybody hangs out, because otherwise you are infringing on not everybody wants to do this. So we need a special space which is for the project. 12 people come along, let's say 12 people come along. There would always be 2 of us facilitating this. And that's always been, since the beginning of Age Exchange, a very important role. We probably will come from the same background, which is a theatre background, but not always. It may be that, I'm a professional dancer, you're a professional theatre maker, and we're going to be able to offer different complementary skills. But one of the crucial things about there being 2 of us, or what we would call RAPs, Reminiscence Arts Practitioners, is that we swap roles. I am leading, facilitating. You are providing emotional support to those in the group that you feel need extra support. So you may be moving between the group in the circle to sit beside Jack, because Jack is hard of hearing, or Jack needs a little bit more what we would call person-centered care in order to participate. Also, it means that sometimes we realize that you will communicate better with some members of the group, and I will communicate better with other members of the group. And that's just life, isn't it? So we have to acknowledge that. But it enables us to form a dynamic, and also it reduces the pressure on one practitioner to try and control a situation with 12 people with whom he is effectively, or she is effectively, improvising. So that's really important. The first couple of sessions are about getting to know who is in the group, and we have worked traditionally over many years with reminiscence triggers, as we would call them. We have thematic reminiscence boxes which contain objects, artifacts, photographs, diaries, perfumes, gloves, hats, things that go back to, sometimes back to the 1920s, 30s, 40s. We have thematic boxes on looking good, dressing up, going out, wash day, the wartime, dance, the 1950s, rock and roll, all sorts of things. So as we get to know the group, we would begin working with quite generally, but as we get to know the group week on week, we will bring in things that I know you are specifically interested in, that relate to your personal heritage, or and so it becomes more person-centered. So although we are a group, with reminiscence work, you will always really be a group of individuals, and that we cannot take for granted that we cannot make sweeping statements. We cannot we cannot what's the word? Look at the past as a nostalgic thing. Reminiscence is not about nostalgia. Reminiscence is about bringing the past into the present in order to do something meaningful in the present. It's not that awful thing which the British are so talking about, colonial Britain, and talking about Brexit and all of those things. The British are known for being hopelessly nostalgic, of creating a view of the past which is rose-tinted and, and the imperial and all of this shit. Sorry, excuse my language. But you know what I mean? So with reminiscence theatre, what we're trying to do is bring the truth, bring people's individual truths and their life experiences, and look at them in the present. But week on week, over a period of time, we find out what people are interested in. We identify key memories. We work in ways which will quite enable people to have a lot of personal choice. So if I gave a couple of examples of exercises, a lovely project we had in 2017 in a care home in Essex, we looked at photography. We asked people to think of photographs which they wish had been taken in their lives, but they never were. If I asked you to think of that, you know, of a photograph you wished you'd had, what would it have been of? And one of my absolute favorites was a very disabled lady called Elsie, who was in her 90s and very disabled, but all of the things she wanted to talk about were about freedom and the outdoors and play and all of these things. And she had a lovely memory of her brother building a go-kart and going down the hill on this go-kart and screaming because they didn't have any brakes, and it went straight off into the pond at the end of the thing, and they both went, you know, thrown into the water, and she screamed with laughter at this, you know, this kind of memory. And she was back there, you know, so we looked at how we could dramatize that scene. So it's about finding the stories that people want to tell. It's not, and this is very key in reminiscence work. My role as a director is really a facilitative role, as I'm sure, you know, as in documentary theatre. It's not a directorial role. It is not for me to tell you which story you bring to the stage. Because if I'm doing that, I don't think I'm really being true to verbatim theatre or documentary theatre or reminiscence theatre. I'm actually being true to myself as an artist, and that's not really what this is about. This is about empowering, you know, vulnerable people and helping them use the stage as a way to you know, to give them a voice.
Yeah. But you said sometimes. Well, you said sometimes a stage may not be the best platform to reflect their stories or their experiences. So what is the consideration? How would you make the consideration?
Yeah, I think so. The project that we ran in 2017 was supposed to be a reminiscence theatre project in a care home, and it's one of those, you know, one of those projects where we were commissioned, we went into the home and immediately became aware that the older people that we were working with, we had very high levels of disability. We were working also, and this we were slightly surprised by this, but we were also working with people with, some people had high levels of dementia. Some people were suffering from depression. Now, absolutely, the arts are the right place to work, you know, with people from those backgrounds. But myself and my colleague, who's also a professional actor, and we just said, hang on here, you know, there is a lot happening in this group. That, you know, there's a lot of low self-esteem. There's a lot of sadness. There's sort of bereavement, grief, and I think if we were going to be creating theatre, I would say that would be the next project, not this project. I think we need to, a bit like we were talking about with the, you know, the Veterans Project, where clearly there's this amazingly long build up where you're researching whether you know, how this is going to work. And I think we just became aware in this project that, you know, people needed, they just needed to be heard. So we made it a closed group. You know, we took it away from the stage. We used a lot of role play. And they were terrifically good at role play, and in the end, we created a very simple half-hour documentary where we filmed them working together, sharing memories together, and also sharing individual heritage and life stories. And then we showed the film together, and they were very happy with that as an outcome. So I think it's also that thing of needing to be flexible, and when you don't know who you're going to be working with, I think, and this is quite difficult with funding, isn't it? Because quite often you have to say, we're going to do A, B, C, and D, you know. But if you don't need to do that, I think you need to give yourself and the group time to reflect on what they want to do. So after we'd had about 4 sessions, we decided we wouldn't create a piece of theatre, we'd create a film instead, and that was fine. But that came from understanding that the group were they had a lot going on, and there was quite a lot of pain in that group, and that they needed a lot more time. When we go back, if we go back, it would be fantastic now to look at a piece of theatre, because I think, you know, it's all about winning trust, isn't it? And the trust is now there, the way of working is now there. But it took quite a long time to build that up.
You have used the word empowered several times. So can you explain a bit how, in your experience, how theater can empower your clients, the people you work with? Can you?
Yeah, I think it's funny actually, because without you, if you hadn't pointed it out, I wouldn't have realised that I'd used the word. But I think it's I don't know. Do you know what I probably my education is probably not atypical. When I started studying English and drama, a long time back in the 1980s, I remember having an English teacher who insisted on telling us that we were part of the top 5% in Britain. We were blessed that we would have access to the arts, and only 5% of British people really access the arts or enjoy the arts. And I remembered, and I was quite political at that time, and just thinking, this is absolutely terrible. This is wrong. What about the other 95%? What are the arts for? And always being really just sort of that was stuck with me. And then I came from a rural part of England to train in London as an actor. And the 80s were a very political time, actually, because we had, Margaret Thatcher was prime minister at that time. It was a pretty grim time, and we had the strikes and we had race riots and all sorts of things. And I just felt that somehow theatre and the arts had to provide a voice. That there had to be, there's nothing wrong with a lovely film or a musical or whatever, but I suppose that's really where my interest in documentary and documentary theatre kind of began, was being very aware of the excluded and being told that the arts were elite and that they were for an elite. So I did a lot of work in young people's theatre, in rep theatre, and then I became very interested in the role of memory in performance, and that's what I wrote my master's degree on. And so when you go into my very first project in a care home in Bournemouth in 1998, 1999, and you go into a care home, you're very conscious of the vulnerability of the people in that space. You're very conscious that you are working with people who are very isolated, and that's a great irony, but often in care settings there's no mechanism for those people to come together. They're often there's no mechanism for them even to understand that they have more in common than perhaps they realize. Often that principal key role of someone who we call an activities coordinator or a participatory artist does not exist in a care home. So you go in and you begin that process of hearing people's stories, and you just think, wow, these are people who are forgotten. These are people who have been placed on the fringes of society. We need to find a way for them to share the stories and the things that that they have lived through. And theatre does seem to me so often to be the place for that, because one of the things about reminiscence theatre is that it's the best that theatre has to offer, isn't it? It's the immediacy. It's live. You're watching the person sweat. You're hearing the story come from them, and when that person is the author of that story and they have lived through that experience, and you're sitting 3 meters away from them, for them to share that story is empowering for them. It's because they feel valued, and also because, and this is another really important element in intergenerational work, they feel that they are teaching you something, that through giving you their story, that's that the handing over of my story to you, it's now your story as well, and then you can reciprocate and hand your story to me, and that's really, it's very, very simple, but these stories are often quite allegorical. They often have kind of multiple meanings. They may be about, you know, often older people choose to share stories about their mothers, you know, long dead, maybe dead 60, 70 years, you know, but they choose to bring that woman back to life again because she was this kind of person who endured these things, who taught me these things. And these are the things I remember doing with her as a girl. And these are the things I would like to perform. But what you're actually teaching the audience is about, you know, it's a kind of everyman story. That, you know, the mother symbolizes, she's not just my mother, she's actually your mother and your mother and your mother. And we are all understanding that. And that's very, very cathartic. And I think the thing about empowerment as a word is that you're taking someone who perhaps is frail physically, perhaps who is isolated and lonely, and you are supporting them in performing their heritage, their story, and that often this is part of their life review. It's part of them coming to terms with the life they have lived. And at the very end, often when they didn't feel anybody cared, you as the audience are there to provide that recognition. And it's not necessarily getting up and roaring and clapping or whatever, but it's and it can be, but it's a recognition that that the life you have lived is important, and the people and the experiences you've had are important, and that's really valuable. And the other side, as I said, is often these untold stories are remarkable. And I turned up to Age Exchange to work there for 6 months, and that was 22 years ago, because when my first experience and second and third and fourth and fifth experience of working in a care home and hearing older people share these stories, you know, sometimes people in their early hundreds, you know, and you are transported. You are transported in the time machine to this place, which somehow isn't the past, it's the present again. And you have a glimpse into a world and into a way of living. And these things are important to share while they're still there, because they are disappearing. And it's important to pass them on. So yeah, I think empowering is the term, but it's on different layers. It's the storyteller, it's the audience, and I think it's also, on a wider sense, we are actually recording these stories and sharing them for you know, archiving them for young people and for people who, you know, in the future.
Can you give me one experience that made you, well, you have been doing this for more than 20 years, so there must be something that's really, that has had a strong impact on you to make you go on for 20 years. So was there such a moment?
I think it's, I mean, theatre is obviously, you know, theatre is important, and it sometimes we only use theatre in a therapeutic way and without an audience. But I suppose if there are many individuals that I remember working with who, and it's always the simple things. I mean, a very strong experience for me was actually working with a Holocaust survivor, Helen Aronson, who was a survivor of the Lodz ghetto. And she had been 12 when the SS came to her village in Pabianice in Poland and divided up, took everybody to the local football stadium and divided everybody up, which was shocking. And you know, the children were taken away. Children under the age of 12 were taken away to be exterminated. Older people were taken away with the disabled to be exterminated. And her father insisted on going with those people who were going to die, because he was a leader of the village, and he would die with them, you know. So I mean, this is a terrible story. And Helen's agreed to come and share this story with our youth theatre, our young people's theatre. Talking about the ritual of theatre, it always began with eating. So the young people who worked with her, they would go to her house, she would share her story, and then we would all eat together. And that was a very important ritual that went with remembering and sharing the story. And then we began to devise the play based on her childhood and her life. And there were two things that happened within the rehearsal process. She would come and watch the rehearsals. She insisted on that, even though she wanted to make sure it was authentic, that we were true to her experience. We used, interestingly, by the way, we used a lot of personal photographs that she found that were taken from the Wiener Library, and also some film footage of Lodz taken by the Nazis. But two things happened which always stood out for me. 240,000 Jews had lived in the ghetto in Łódź, in Lodz. And at the very end of the war, the Germans decided to liquidate the entire ghetto, and they took everybody. And they left behind only 750 of those 250,000 people. And the job of those left behind, who were also supposed to be exterminated at the end, was to go house to house and empty everything in these houses where the Jews had lived, who had been transported to Auschwitz and so on. And they had to take these things into the street and bundle them up in a particular way, the clothes, the cooking utensils, anything of value, and those things were then to be taken back to Germany. And we tried to devise this scene, and we had things that were taken out into the street, and I always remember that Helen stood up and she said, "We didn't do it like that." And she was, in her 80s then. And she came up onto the stage and she knelt next to an actress and she started to fold up the clothes, remembering how she had folded the clothes, in those horrific circumstances in 1944. And I just remember the impact that had on the actors, that they became obsessed with getting it right, with doing this out of respect and honor for her, but it was seeing this 80-year-old woman show a group of actors with great care how she had been told to fold the clothes by the Gestapo or whatever. That was the first thing. And the second thing that always stayed with me was that she'd had a job in the orphanage in Lodz, where she was told to look after the unaccompanied children. And she used to tell them the story of Hansel and Gretel. And she said that they always liked me to tell them the story, but their house wasn't made of biscuits, it was made of bread, because that's what they didn't have. They didn't have bread. And then Helen had an infection. She was very ill. And while she was ill, her brother came and said, "I'm really, Helen, they are liquidating the orphanage and the children are being transported to Auschwitz." And she ran to the station, and the trains were pulling out, and all of the children were taken away. And that was the most shocking and traumatic thing. And her brother, in memory of these children and Helen's love of the children, he had made for her, I smuggled it, I think, a little compact, for powdering your face. But on the outside of this little silver-plated compact was a little carving of Hansel and Gretel.
Mm.
And when we came to work on this scene in the production, I think the thing that was just extraordinary was they had a young actor called John, and John was playing Miriam's brother, and was playing Helen's brother. And Helen got up on stage, and just before they started this scene, she went up to the young actor, and she had a tiny red velvet little package, and she put it in his hand, and she said, "I think this will help you." And he opened the package, and inside was the little silver compact of Hansel and Gretel that her brother had actually given her in 1944. And she said, "I want you to have this for the duration of the production, because this is real." And I think it's those moments where the past has connected with the stage, has connected with the actors, and had an authenticity which you can hear the audience take a deep breath. You can hear that. You can hear that, and I think that's why, as much as I love Shakespeare and and so on, something about those stories of the people's stories on stage being transmitted to an audience in a way like that through, whether it's what Helen did with the compact or whatever is extraordinary. And then just the last one, which I think you may have heard before, which I apologize, is a very old lady I worked with in a home. She was in her early 90s, and we worked on the exercise with the photographs. She chose a photograph that she wanted to perform. The memory was from 1915, and it was of her father, who was a shoemaker, and he had run away to enlist in the army to go and fight in the First World War. And her memory that she chose to perform, which came from improvisation and so on, was that in December, Christmas Eve, 1915, it was snowing, and she was playing in the street. She hadn't seen her father for a long time, I think 6 months, and a man walked towards her and her sister in the street through the snow. And only when he got very close did she realize it was her father, but he looked completely different. He was very thin, he was in uniform, but he had got it in his head that he wanted to come home from the trenches in France. So he'd got 3 days leave, and he wanted to cut down a Christmas tree and decorate this Christmas tree with his daughter. And so the object was the tree, and all she wanted to perform was the memory of going out down into the woods with her father to cut down the tree, to drag it back home, to put it in a bucket, and to decorate the tree together. And she wanted to retell and share again the things that they had said to each other while they decorated the tree. And the scene lasted, I think, 7 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. And I remember that when it finished, because I should have made the connection, this was in a very particular part of England where the Dorset Regiment had fought in the First World War, and the effect her story had on the audience, I've never seen anything like it. People were weeping. It was, profound. It clearly was a story which spoke to their hearts and spoke to their community. And all we did was share this, almost forgotten story. And at the end of it, her daughter was in the audience and her granddaughter, and they came up, and they were, really moved. And Phyllis, who was, very old and frail, and she said, I remember her saying this, she said, "Now it's yours. Now it's your memory." And I thought, this is so interesting. This is like, a passing on of something that people don't want to die, because it will always have value. And I think that's something which really sticks with me about this way of working. The things that we value, and sometimes they seem so small, but they're actually huge.
Yeah. Okay. So, aging is globally is something we need to really face. Aging, the issue of aging, and so what do you think theater can do for it? Because I thought that your major target groups are the older people, the older generation. So. So what do you think? I think theater in general can do for this?
I think theater. I think, well, in this case, theater. I think also I would say all art forms. I think often in what we do, and I'm sure it's the same with yourself, is it's a sort of often a multidisciplinary approach. The use of film in performance, the use of stills photography in performance, the use of archive film in performance. So it's quite the use of dance in performance, So, but theatre itself, I think I had a lady in a group that this is way back in 2000, 1999, 2000, lady called Linda. And we were working on a production where dockers were performing their stories with local young people, and the Docklands community, or the dockers community, is a pretty tough community. And I always remember that we did everything we could to try and create an authenticity. We built a boat on the stage. We had a pub that we built on the stage. And she came up to me afterwards and she said, "I know what you've done." She was great character. She said, "I know what you've done. You've helped us bring our energy from the past into the present, and we can keep it here for as long as we possibly can." And I found that really interesting, because when I looked at them performing, I wasn't so aware of their frailties. I wasn't so aware of the label of aging or disability. I was aware of who they are as people, and the spirit of Linda is the spirit of an 18-year-old young woman who is in the prime of life, whereas in reality she was 78. And I think that's one of the things that theatre can do. Theatre is a place of at its best, of great freedom, isn't it? It's a place which enables all stories to be told, and a place of play and improvisation. And I think that's another key thing about theatre. Depending on how you devise, or whether you're devising, and usually in reminiscent theatre, particularly with older people, we don't have a script. We work through constant devising and improvising. My team know the person's story inside out, but we guide them through their performance. We don't try and give them their own words back to them. So one of the other things I think which is crucial with older people is the joy they find within improvisation, the joy they find within giving something a go, and we call it taking a healthy risk. So often with older people, you think, oh, we can't take any risks with him. He's frail, he's A, B, C, D, he's diabetic, he doesn't walk well. We're always thinking about the things a person can't do, not the things they can do. So I think with theatre, you're able to use improvisation to give people to help them play, and play at all stages of life is important.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty much what it is, really. And I think the other thing about it is the older people love seeing each other perform. They love it, and they will so often say, "Can I help you? Can I be in her story? I'll play your grandmother." or they love that, entering into each other's worlds, but they're also very aware of the privilege that is to enter into each other's worlds. And the responsibility. So I need you to tell me, how did your grandmother speak? Oh, she used to talk about this, that, and the other, and we go and hang the washing out together, or we do, on wash day, or we always go and sit on a chair at the end of the garden and have a cigarette together, and talk about all the women in the street, or all of those things. So I think the other great thing about it is theatre enables people to reflect on periods in their lives which maybe were difficult, but in a way which is somehow meaningful. I think some people view the stage is a very sort of spiritual space, and I don't mean in a conventional religious way, but it has a sort of a spiritual value to it. And they love the recreation of environments, that we're going back to create the cotton mill, or we're in our backyard in 1964, or they love the way that it can be inventive and take you to different places, or but it also it brings into it also brings into the fore the thing which I also think is incredibly important in reminiscence work, and that is the value of humor and mischief. And I think that's really, really important. People are expected to behave in a particular way in our culture, And actually, people sometimes need to behave really badly and be really mischievous and playful and laugh and, you know, make fools of themselves and clown about and all of those things. So as much as we look at some sad stories, we also like to bring to the stage those other stories, and hearing people laugh out loud and laugh together when you haven't heard that sound in that setting before is absolutely dynamite. And I think it also brings into important the other side of this, which is about what is sustained beyond the life of your production. What do you leave behind, which is of value? And that's something we try and write into our projects. You know, so often we work very closely with care managers, we work with staff, we train staff, we try and encourage staff to perform alongside the elders, you know, in small roles, or to help sit beside with us when we're facilitating memories. So there's quite often a training element in there as well. But we like to think, what can be sustained beyond the life of this project? It's not just about us going in and doing something great and then saying bye, that's it. And I think this goes back to your first question and research-based theatre. You have a responsibility. You're working with real people. You're working with living memory. You have an ethical responsibility. You are not there to steal their life story. You are there to actually, you know, to look at how that story can be shared. And you ultimately, we call it person-centered care. You have a caring role to the person that you're working with.
Yeah. So are there any, after so many years experience, so do you think, are there anything to be observed when ones want to work with the older people? Yeah, of course, as you said, there are a lot of advantages, but are there any tips for people?
Yeah, we have a sort of set of rules which originally came to us from Professor Faith Gibson. And Professor Faith Gibson, who's Australian, but she's from the University of Ulster, and she's one of the kind of pioneering figures in reminiscence work, and worked with Pam Schweitzer, you know, back in the very early 1980s, and also people like Tom Kitwood, who's also one of the, you know, real fathers of reminiscence, and particularly in dementia care. You know, if you are the facilitator, you have to look very carefully at your role. You cannot be judgmental. You must be empathetic. You have to remember that older people maybe need more time. Time is something you really need to think about in the work that you're doing with older people. You know, have you given enough time? You know, and obviously time means different things to us, and that's really crucial. That's particularly if you work with people with dementia. It's really important, the issue of understanding how people work in different sort of time frames. You have to make sure that you give opportunities for creativity in different ways, and I think being very prescriptive is not good. You have to allow there to be what we call almost like you know, multiple ways of looking at something. So we'll try this, then we'll try that, and then we'll try this. So you have to be very, very open. I think it's really important that you work through the process of group work and sharing stories and facilitating a group where people get to know each other's stories, and that you work as a company. I think giving your co-workers emotional support is crucial, and so we have quite strict rules about that. We quite often meet regularly and talk about the memories that are shared with us. So we actually have our own little support group where we can actually offload a little bit, because often you hear things and sometimes those things are shared for the first time in a long time. non-judgmental attitude, taking time, taking healthy risks, making sure that that you are building the project week on week, never taking anything for granted, never generalizing, stereotyping, all of those things. Perceiving older people in a particular way is the enemy of this way of working. You know, you look at the person, you don't define them by their age. I think that's really, really important, and certainly Britain struggles with major issues around ageism and attitudes to aging, which are very damaging. And in terms of our facilitators, I would say we're very careful about how we select them. And ironically, I'm particularly careful about how I select actors or anybody coming from an acting community, which is probably because I've been one, and so, you know, your role it's not about your performance, darling. You know, it's not about me. It's not about me. Your role is really the role of an actor carer. It's a weird combination of two words that really don't belong together at all. But, you know, your role is to help facilitate the creativity of another person. It may be that you're playing Phyllis's father. You know, she said, I want you to play the dad, or I want you. So you're often playing the role which enables them to take to take center stage. So it's quite a complex role, because you're looking out for their well-being. You're making sure that they're safe. You know, does she have a walking frame, a walking stick? Is she in a wheelchair? But at the same time, you are performing. And if there isn't a script and it's a piece of improvised, devised theatre, you have to know everything. You have to know the structure of the story she is going to tell. You probably improvised this scene 20 times together. So you have to be on it and sharp. And if something goes wrong, you step in and improvise, because the older person can never be vulnerable. You need to make sure that if something goes wrong, you're going to make you'll have to look the fool if need be. But your role is to make sure that by the end of her performance, she is proud of what she has achieved. So it's a very unusual role for an actor, because it's very much combined with a caring role. And also the fact that you will have devised this piece of work together. So it's more like it's it feels like a huge responsibility. And I think, speaking to whether they're reminiscence practitioners who work in theatre, or some of our team who are artists or musicians or dancers, because you're working with the person, you really feel the responsibility, and it can feel quite overwhelming at times, that responsibility, because you have encouraged them to express themselves and their own lives and the lives of others, maybe long dead, through the medium of the arts. And therefore you have a responsibility to make sure that that medium empowers them and does them no harm.
So apart from working with older people, you also work a lot with the younger generation, you know, the college students, the school students. So sorry for being generalizing.
No, but yeah. I mean, it's not, yeah.
Is there any general difference between the two groups?
Well, traditionally, age exchange, I mean, so we're embarking on an intergenerational project at the moment, but it probably won't be a theatre project, and that's partly because of COVID-19 and so on. Traditionally, in intergenerational theatre, so usually we bring the generations together, and age exchange's name came about through intergenerational work, the exchange of ages, the exchanges of age-based experience. If we're creating intergenerational theatre, it actually begins as any piece of work with older people would begin. We'd always begin by working with the generations separately. So we would probably facilitate, you know, a number of reminiscent sessions with the elders, you know, hoping that they're going to stay on board to create theatre with the younger people, so that the older people can identify themes, stories, songs. They can also begin to have the experience of acting out and role play, and you know what that dynamic what means. If this is a real serious piece of what I think we would call research-based theatre, we sometimes, thinking back to the Docs project, we would have recorded the older people's stories. So quite often we would interview older people. We would interview them one-to-one, sometimes in groups, but one-to-one, transcribe those interviews, and then we would meet with some of the young people, and we would introduce them to some of the older people they're going to meet through those transcriptions. So, and we would role play, we'd do some gentle role play. So you're going to meet Harry and Jill and Tom and Sue, you know, but for the next 3 weeks, we're just going to role play some of these stories. You're preparing the generations to work together, and that's a really crucial thing. And then you bring those generations together, but they already have knowledge of each other through the stories that have been shared. And I think that's really, really important. So what I love about that is when they do come together, often the young people say, oh, that's Beryl, or that's John, or that's Jack. And they go up and introduce themselves. And there's already a knowledge of the older people. So that's crucial. I think with intergenerational work, traditionally there was a big failing of it, was that it was very much about the older person being primarily valued as the story giver, and I think that can disempower the younger people. So I think at its best you need to make sure that the young people are able to share their story equally, that the older people can help perform those stories or whatever, but I think it has to be set up in a way that it's not one generation in the ascendancy over the other. It's an equal exchange, and I think that's really important. And I can certainly think of projects that I've run where I failed to do that, because you know you can get very wrapped up in the older people's stories and in the power of what they bring to share. So you have to be careful about that. The big project that we did on the First World War in London, where older people brought their family stories from the First World War, which was incredibly powerful. There were many things that could not be expressed through words, which were about feelings, you know, grief and loss and love and goodbyes and things that were hard to say. So we were very fortunate. We had a group of very good young students, and they choreographed a whole series of dances, which stylized feelings and things, so that and we had live music and stuff like that. So it gave them a role of knowing that the things that could not be said, that they were responsible for those things in the production, and that's crucial. So yeah, I think it's great. And again, I think at its best, again, you see this thing where you see your cast on stage, and you know that they have stopped defining each other by age. You know, they are just seeing each other as fellow performers. You know, and wanting to do justice to stories which they're bringing to life, which are real. You know, which belong to either the people on stage, or, as often happens, people that don't want to perform will actually say, but I would like my story to be performed, so I'm giving it to you for the production to use. And then you know that those people are going to come, they're going to sit in the audience, and it's going to be quite an experience for them to see that, you know, their story brought to life on stage.
Well, you know, this talk, in fact, is a part of the program in a series of programs entitled, you know, the End of Life Carers.
Yes.
I mean, we focus on this particular group, End of Life Carers, and because I found that this issue, carers in general, are not well recognized in Hong Kong, and particularly End of Life Carers, when they have, you know, they have to face a lot of pressure, and yeah, and you know, and also in Chinese culture, death is a taboo, so we tend not to talk about it most of the time.
Yeah.
And so can you say a bit about the situation in the UK? I mean, is it the end-of-life carers, or are they well supported?
Yeah. So we, well, just briefly, I suppose I'd say, we at Age Exchange, one probably the predominant area of our work is actually around supporting people with dementia and their family carers. So, and you know, that's a very big project. And actually, when COVID-19 hit and everything was closed in Britain, I mean, Age Exchange closed on the 19th of March. Its centre, where we normally visit, you know, we have 185,000 visitors a year. We run 9 programs supporting people with dementia and their family carers through Reminiscence Arts. And suddenly everything was closed. And, you know, over 150 people that we would work with face to face were at home and not able to leave their homes and shielding. And so we have been, you know, really involved. We created a new program which is called Virtual Daycare, where we're supporting 75 couples at home with, you know, reminiscence activity boxes, befriending calls, Zoom daycare, all sorts of different things. So it's a very big area of our work, and we feel as a charity a very important mission in our work is to support people with mental health needs and family carers, and that is not only older family carers. We also have 2 groups that we run at Age Exchange for people with young onset dementia, who are, you know, in their 50s and 60s, and sometimes their carers may be their children. So that's also a big issue. I think there were some figures that came out recently that that it's an absolutely huge amount of money that family carers save the British state. It's some absolutely vast sum in the multi-millions that they save the state by giving their life to supporting, you know, their loved one with, you know, a terminal illness, or with dementia or Alzheimer's, and we as a charity became increasingly concerned that things were changing in Britain around care. Less people were going into residential care, and more people were staying at home with what are called care packages. You know, where someone will come in and, you know, bring food, or, you know, the social services will be involved, or the general practitioner will be involved. But on the whole, what has happened is that a lot of people are isolated and cut off, providing care to a loved one with multiple health issues, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And one of the big things with dementia often is that sleep patterns are really badly affected. You know, it might be that you're awake between 1 in the morning and 5 o'clock, and I'm your carer, and I might be 83 years of age, but I am awake with you for those many hours, and you are very disorientated. It might be that you're suffering from, you know, a urinary tract infection. You might be suffering from depression, because usually depression runs with dementia, you know, they go together. So the incredible burden on family carers is absolutely huge in Britain. There is recognition of it, there is an understanding of it, that is happening, and there are organizations which are committed to Alzheimer's UK, Age UK. You know, there are organizations which are particularly concerned about the situation of carers, end-of-life carers. But I think there's also a major issue in that we are approaching a stage where, I think 2030, where people with dementia, for example, will outnumber the number of carers, and there will not be enough carers to care for the people that need care. You know, so we will get to the stage where we have taken for granted as a society for too long that the family will step in. and that they will take on the burden. They will take over the, for as long as they possibly can, and often what you find in reality is so often you get to the stage where the family carer maybe dies before the person that they are supporting, because they are completely burnt out and that they are exhausted, and that is a huge issue, huge problem. So our projects, which are 9 projects which support people with dementia and their carers, over the years I think we've adjusted the projects very much to being equally focused on the two. Whereas before we were very focused on the person with dementia, and thinking, that this is the person who is suffering. But more and more we've kind of looked at making sure that we give equal support to the carer as much as to the person with, with the end of life condition. And so often their isolation is what's so shocking. And so it's very important to try and create a network of carers to try and help them be in touch with each other. And that's been a very big thing actually during lockdown with COVID-19. Hence, we set up 2 pilot Zoom projects so that carers could speak to each other. What's happening with you? Well, we're at home. Bill is suffering with this. I'm dealing with this. I'm really struggling. You don't sound like you're struggling to me. You sound like you're doing brilliantly. So it's just making sure that you create ways for them to exchange their experience with each other, because it's the isolation which spirals, and the isolation and the loneliness and the fact that there seems to be nothing to look forward to. So I think that's a very important role again for the arts to play, because when we bring people together, it's great for them to talk, but they often want to do something. They want to make something. And one of our volunteers put it brilliantly. She was saying, we were talking to all the people that you support, and she said, do you know why they come here? And I said, well, they come here to be together, and they come here because they're fond of age exchange. Yeah, she said, but I think you often forget that they come here to learn. And a lot of the times we forget that people, even at the end of life, want to keep learning. And that's something they can do through the arts, and they often express that. I've learned how to paint, I've learned how to perform, I've learned how to sing, I've learned how to waltz. And I think that's really, really important, that people can be creative and active, and that's something that I think is really crucial. I mean, in terms of the situation, I think Britain has got a terrible problem with understanding to what extent carers are keeping our society going in terms of supporting the most vulnerable people, family carers and professional carers. And one of the huge things that's come to light during the pandemic, everyone was talking about the terrible situation our National Health Service was facing, and so on. But for a long time, the government, we as a nation forgot that huge numbers of older people were dying in care homes, and that health and social care for older people is often just seen as the poor relation to every other form of care, and is again on the fringes of society. And there's a lot of political pressure at the moment about that in Britain, that one thing that has to come out of all of this is that we really need a reappraisal of how we see older people in care and what we feel is our responsibility to them as a society.
Well, I hope something good will come out of it then.
Yeah.
And so my experience after engage on this issue for a very short time, for only about a year, I found the biggest challenge is, as you say, the carers, they feel a lot of they feel very isolated, and because they feel that it's all their burden. I remember in one interviews I've done with a carer, and the phrase that it's only me came a lot of time from in the interview. And they always felt this is all the burdens is on themselves, and no one can take up this burden. And I found it's maybe because of my experiences, I've been still thinking about getting them out to see a performance. So I found it's difficult to put them to pull them out of the to the theater, or at least to see a performance, to pull them out of their burden. So can you give advice on this?
I think it's it's often really difficult, isn't it? But particularly because so often there's no one else involved. I mean, where is the rest of the family? Where are the children? Or so it's quite hard to bring the carer out when they don't feel there's anybody else to step into their role. So that's a big thing. I think one thing that we did is when we set up our kind of they're called reminiscence arts in daycare or reminiscence arts in residential care. We originally intended to separate the carers into one group and the participants, their loved ones with dementia, into another group. And that was originally, we thought we could do that and it will provide a sort of respite. And it was terribly unpopular. and it was and interestingly, the carers said to us, and I remember Jeanette, wonderful carer, wonderful person, and she said, well, actually, we could have shared respite, which is where we feel that we're lifted out of our caring role and that we can do something together, which is not cleaning, which isn't going to the doctor, which isn't bathing, which isn't washing, which is not one of the roles that we play all the time, feeding. So what we do is we look at in our program at they come together, but we use all sorts of things, theatre, role play, dance, and so on, that they can do together, which they would never normally do. So it's new to both of them. It's new. And quite often, and combining that with reminiscence, and quite often they will go back to something which is a happy place, a happy memory, which they can share together. And that is so valuable for the carer in particular, that they see their loved one again, in a way that a memory which was a strong memory, a time when they were strong together, or, positive memory, or so on and so forth. Or also, of course, through a wonderful Jim and Margaret. Margaret had very advanced dementia, and we were working in a project with Trinity Laban School of Music and Dance, and part reminiscence theatre, part dance. And Margaret had lost the power to talk, to speak, but still had the embodied memory of being able to dance. And so when they came to the groups, what we'd always do is play music, live music, and play music, and they would dance together. And for Jim, the carer, this was an incredibly important time for him. That he was dealing with end of life care for Margaret, but one day a week they would come to the centre into a place where they did something different, which wasn't about the drudgery of care and suffering. It was actually light and not dark, and they would dance, and it was something they loved. And although she was very ill, she could still waltz, and that was beautiful. So I think if you can't bring the carer out on their own, then it's a question of finding something which is creative that they can make together, and looking at things that they can do which are expressive and creative and theatrical, that they can do together, which I think is equally important, because it's not part of nursing, and you're also getting them out of their house, which is also crucial.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's inspiring. Yeah,
it's never easy, though, is it? It's not easy. And as we both know, it's always about the individual. This is the other thing. There's no blanket way of doing anything, is there? Everybody is different. And it's very frustrating, you know. If you can work with the carers on their own and bring that's great, but I think most of what we end up doing is finding out that there's really nobody else to provide that caring role, and so the pressure is to find ways of working with people together, you know, and couples together, but that's, yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah. And so, I want to talk about films, because I found in your work, films is also one of the elements you always use. So alongside with theater, so when do you decide to use films? When do you decide to use theater? And when do you decide to use both?
Okay. Yeah. I think it kind of came about through. It's always I have to say, so many things are an accident. You know? So we were working in a very rural part of England in Norfolk, and we were working in a day centre and some of the elders in the group had never left that village, you know, and they would tell you they had nothing to say, you know, we don't really have, we you know, we've always stayed here, and they were from a farming community, and they talked about how they would bring in the harvest, which, you know, as we know, it would have been with horses and carts and ploughing by hand and harvesting by hand, and so we went originally looking for reminiscence triggers, and we thought, let's try and find some archive film, and the Norfolk Film Archive had film from this area where we were working of farmers and children bringing in the harvest in I think it was 1923. I don't know why I think it was 1923. So it was a silent movie. So we took this into play for the ladies, you know, and said, is this the sort of thing? And oh wow, it was like their world just was suddenly, you know, opened up again, and they remembered themselves as children, you know, following the horses and picking up the ears of corn and helping make the stacks, you know, as they would have been and so on. And so we thought, well, this is nice, isn't it? You know, why don't we show the film and you know, let the two ladies talk about their memories of what it was like as a child, you know. And so in a way it became a way of showing the audience, you know, how life had been, as much as it was a trigger for the you know, the elders themselves, and it provided that fantastic, you know, authenticity and credibility as well. So we've quite often, you know, in very simple ways, illustrated memory on stage with film, as we have often illustrated memory on stage with stills. So very often, you know, we've asked people to bring things, you know, would you bring some photographs with you when you come to meet Age Exchange? You know, don't bring everything, but maybe bring some photographs that are important to you. And they have so often ended up projected, you know, on a theatrical wall or on a cinema screen, you know, because they help tell the story. So that's been important from a theatrical perspective. And then film really isn't really my world, and but it goes back to what I think I said earlier about, you know, realizing that theatre isn't always the thing. So maybe we need to look at, you know, other ways that we can record a project, and often it's about recording the experience, which is kind of documenting the experience on film, isn't it? You know, so for example, an obvious one would be, I think I might have talked about it in Canada, but in 2016, Britain was into, you know, the second year of a major commemoration of the end of the First World War, which is 100 years on, and 2016 was the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. And there had been a lot of funded work in Britain about the war and the impact of the war. And I had been very involved in a big theatre project, Children of the Great War, working with London families. And I was very concerned that no one was reaching out to work with Germany, you know, and that this seemed really sad. And also I was very, very concerned about the narrative of remembrance in this country. And I think the narrative of the remembrance of the First and the Second World War has often been quite very militaristic, and it's very associated with victory and so on. And I felt that, you know, that I wanted to go somewhere else a bit deeper than that. So it was very complicated, and it took a very long time talking about research-based theatre. But eventually, myself and Elfriede Pauli, who's an Austrian who supports the Catholic charity Caritas in Bavaria in Germany, we decided that we would attempt to bring British and German elders together whose fathers had fought in the First World War. Or had a connection in that way. And obviously, I mean, right at the very beginning, I thought, wow, if this could only be theatre, you know, if this could be theatre, you know, no one's doing anything like this. This is somewhere else completely. And then I thought, this, you know, the actual logistics were so complicated of trying to, you know, how can we get them together? How long can they be together? How will we deal with the language issues and so on? So in the end, we decided to run, I think it was 5 days originally, of kind of therapeutic interaction between, in the end it was 24 German and British elders who would travel, the Brits would travel to Germany, and they would live for 4 days in Rosenheim and in Munich, and they would spend every day and eating together at night with German elders, and everybody had to have a connection to the First World War. And what I wanted to do was change the narrative and say, let's forget about your nation, forget about my nation, let's talk about your family, let's talk about my family. Let's reduce everything to the family unit, which is a place that we, you know, if you would go to that place, which also is not easy to go to for many of us. So and so we decided that we removed the whole thing from poppies and flags and, you know, all of that, and film was the right thing for that. So we literally filmed German and British elders meeting face to face, sharing their story face to face, and then working on, you know, painting together and working on things together, which was great. So we just knew that was the right thing to do. And similarly, we've worked on other projects using film. We worked on a project with Amnesty International and young people, where we used a lot of archive footage, and we used footage of prisoners of conscience and so on. We worked with refugees as well to do some film work. And I think it wasn't the thing that we originally saw ourselves doing, but I think it's kind of become increasingly important to us. And I don't know, I'm very happy to send it to you if you want, but the most recent thing we've done using film is Age Exchange, inspired by our Canadian friends actually, and the work they've done with veterans. We have worked on a big collaboration with the mental health military charity Combat Stress, and created a film where we trained veterans in filmmaking, and they then traveled around the UK interviewing 73 veterans with mental health problems and recording their stories of combat trigger trauma and treatment, and that film is out and about at the moment, Combat Stress 100. So if you were interested, I'm really happy to send it to you if you'd like to have a peek. It's kind of new for us, but I think it's just a way of recognizing also that it enables us to reach a wider audience. I suppose that's the other part of it, that, you know, even if it's a filmed piece of theatre, or it enables us to reach out to a wider audience and get the message across.
Yes, yes. But something theatre is not replaceable, right? You still think?
No, I don't think anything which is one take, which is. I think theatre is an act of generosity. I think that's the other thing, isn't it? You know, theatre it's incredibly revealing. It's incredibly personal. It's interpersonal, and it's live. And I think it's actually irreplaceable. Yeah, at its best, there's nothing like it. There's no way of bettering that. So. I think film is great, and you know, but I wouldn't pretend that it's Age Exchange's thing. I think it's a way of capturing those stories and sharing them more broadly, and using film when you can't use theatre. That I think, yeah, I would love to go back to doing as much theatre as possible, but it's not always the way here because the funding is always so hard to get.
Yeah. And with the situation now, maybe film can be another way of and sharing the experience. Yes. And okay, so to round up, so what is your coming project? So the combat stress one is going on, right? And we'll go on.
That was incredibly frustrating, really, because we had done all the work with veterans, and they had made their film, which has had quite a big impact, actually. Where it's been, it was a very interesting project because Combat Stress don't have an archive of veterans' stories. So what we wanted to do was put that right, and with their centenary, we saw this as an opportunity to record veterans talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, combat, and impact on their families. So the film was finished and went out in November 2019 in Liverpool, and then it came down to London, and it was about to start going out and about. You know, to places like the National Army Museum and into Wales and over to Northern Ireland and so on, and then the pandemic hit and the whole project was suspended. So we are literally now, last week, looking at starting the project up again and rebooking and rescheduling and beginning work with schools, because that's also an element of the project where veterans will work with young people to share their stories. So that's happening, but it's been tricky. And also Age Exchange is very involved in developing its work in dementia care, which is huge, which is very big for us, and partnering with our merger partner, Community Integrated Care, which is a very big company, and trying to grow age exchanges in other parts of the UK. We're looking at trying to open an age exchange in Kent, in the southeast of England, and hopefully up in the northwest of England, near Manchester, and up in Scotland. So we're trying to expand our work. In terms of a piece of theatre, I haven't got that in front of me right at the moment, but we're hoping that it will be part of the work we develop in Kent next year, which will build on the work we're doing in sort of dementia care. So yeah, it's always a busy time, but like any arts company, as I'm sure you know, it also has to be balanced out by fundraising and, you know, how keeping the charity going financially, which particularly at the moment with the pandemic has been an enormous stress on the team. But yeah, we keep going. We're still there.
Yeah, it seems great. Yeah, just hearing your development, it seems is going to great directions.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.